Welcome back to the show. Today's episode is a little different. We're diving into a story about family, business, loyalty, and betrayal. And honestly, when I first heard this story, I knew we had to bring it here. Alex, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'll be honest, I've never really shared this story publicly before.
That makes it even more special that you're sharing it here. So let's start simple. Who are you and what happened?
My name is Alex Reynolds. I'm 32 years old. And about a year ago, my own father laughed in my face when I asked for a 15% stake in the family business, a company I had spent 12 years helping build from the inside out. That laugh eventually cost him the entire company.
Wait, your father laughed at you? And you're saying that moment ended up costing him the whole company?
Yeah, but to understand how that happened, we need to go back a little. Because this story didn't start in a boardroom. It started in a cubicle.
A cubicle? That's already interesting. Most people imagine family business stories starting with luxury offices.
Not in my case. My world was a gray fabric cubicle on the 5th floor of the Reynolds Logistics Solutions building, about 5 feet by 5 feet. That tiny space was basically my life for more than a decade. The air in that office always smelled the same. Slightly burnt coffee, industrial carpet cleaner, and the constant electrical hum of overworked computers. That smell was the smell of my 20s.
That's such a vivid detail. I think anyone who's worked in an office can picture that immediately.
Exactly. If I leaned back in my chair and stretched my neck, I could barely see a slice of the downtown skyline between two taller buildings. But most of the time, my view wasn't the city. It was the corkboard right in front of me.
What was on it?
Not family photos, not vacation pictures. It was covered with network architecture diagrams, routing graphs, and algorithm sketches. To most people in the office, it looked like a completely different language. But to me, it was poetry.
So you were the technical brain of the company.
Exactly. Meanwhile, 2 floors above me, on the 7th floor, was the executive level. That's where my younger brother, Marcus, worked.
The brother who got the spotlight?
The very same. Marcus had a conference room with floor-to-ceiling glass walls and a panoramic view of the entire city. He even had one of those imported Italian espresso machines. Sometimes I could hear it steaming milk when I was upstairs for meetings.
That's quite a contrast. Cubicle downstairs, luxury upstairs.
Exactly. Marcus had been at the company for 6 years, half the time I had. He had a business degree from an expensive private university and a smile that could sell sand in the desert. I had a degree in computational mathematics and an unusual ability to make the company's incredibly complex logistics network run so smoothly, so silently, that everyone forgot it even existed.
Which is kind of ironic, because when technology works perfectly, nobody notices it.
Exactly. And in the Reynolds family, if you were quiet, you were invisible.
That sounds like a difficult dynamic already.
It was. My father, Richard Reynolds, was the CEO. He was also the founder of the company, the gravitational center our entire corporate solar system orbited around.
One of those strong founder personalities?
Very much so. The classic self-made American businessman. The kind of person who reminds you constantly that he built everything from nothing. At every company party, every interview, every conference speech, he told the same story. How he started Reynolds Logistics Solutions with 1 truck and a dream.
I think every company has that origin story.
Exactly. He was loud, confident, charismatic. A man who believed business was done through handshakes, golf games, and firm pats on the back. And when he looked at Marcus, he saw a younger version of himself.
Let me guess. When he looked at you, he saw something different.
Yeah, I think he saw something like a complicated tool, useful but strange. Something you keep in the basement until the plumbing breaks.
That's a tough position to be in inside your own family.
It is. And the biggest plumbing problem of my career came in the form of our largest client, Several Industries.
A huge contract?
A huge contract. Their contract was the foundation of the company, millions of dollars in yearly revenue. And the renewal negotiation lasted 6 full months.
6 months of pressure.
Exactly. During that time, my cubicle wasn't just my office, it became my entire life. I worked 18-hour days, weekends disappeared, my diet became lukewarm takeout eaten over my keyboard.
That sounds like startup-level obsession.
Pretty much. Because I was building what I believed would be our silver bullet.
What was it?
A new predictive logistics algorithm, one that could reduce Sevil's operating costs by 40% and cut delivery times in half.
That's massive. That kind of improvement could change everything.
Exactly. It was the best work I had ever done, and one Tuesday night, while watching the final lines of code compile, I felt something I hadn't felt in years.
Hope?
Yeah, because this time, they wouldn't be able to ignore it. This time, they couldn't give the credit to someone else. This was undeniable proof of my value.
That must have felt like a turning point.
It did. But there was something else too. Back in my apartment, I had an old external hard drive. Inside it was a folder called Engine Core V1.0, March 2011.
What was in that folder?
The original version of the system I had built a full year before I officially joined the company. I built it in my college dorm room, powered by instant noodles and ambition. Over the years, I built the entire modern infrastructure of Reynolds Logistics Solutions on top of that original architecture.
So the foundation of the company's technology was yours.
Exactly. At the time, I thought I was simply giving my family my best work. I had no idea that old folder would eventually become the only thing stopping me from losing everything.
That sounds like foreshadowing. Something big must have happened after that.
Oh, it did. Because a few weeks later, the company threw a huge celebration, and that's where things really started to change.
A celebration for the contract renewal, right?
Exactly. We had secured the Seville Industries contract for another 5 years. For the company, that was a massive win. And my father loved celebrating victories in a big way. So he organized a party at one of the most expensive hotels downtown.
Let me guess. Executives, investors, clients, the whole industry crowd.
Pretty much. Crystals, chandeliers, live jazz band, waiters walking around with champagne trays. It felt more like a wedding reception than a corporate event.
And where were you in all of this?
Standing near the back of the room with a glass of water, watching everything.
That sounds very on brand for the role you've been describing.
Yeah, I was never really part of the spotlight moments. After about an hour, my father walked onto the stage. The band stopped playing and everyone turned toward him. He grabbed the microphone and started telling the story he always told.
The one truck and a dream story.
Exactly. People laughed at the same jokes they had probably heard a dozen times before. Then he started talking about the Seville contract, how competitive the negotiation had been, how close we supposedly were to losing it.
And then came the big moment.
Yeah, he said he wanted to recognize the person who led the strategy that secured the renewal. And then he called Marcus onto the stage.
Of course he did.
The room exploded in applause. Marcus walked up smiling, shaking hands, looking like he had just closed the deal personally. My father put his hand on his shoulder and started praising his leadership, his vision, his negotiation skills. Meanwhile, I was standing maybe 20 feet away, listening to the applause for something I had spent 6 months building.
That must have been hard to watch.
Honestly, it felt familiar. Marcus had always been the face of things. I had always been the engine behind them.
But something about that night felt different, didn't it?
Yeah, I think it was the exhaustion. 6 straight months of 18-hour days, watching the room celebrate someone else for the work that came out of my cubicle. Something shifted in my head that night.
What did you do?
I didn't cause a scene. I didn't interrupt the speech. I just quietly left, walked out of the ballroom, took the elevator down, and stepped into the cold night air.
And what was going through your mind?
I kept thinking about 12 years. 12 years of invisible work, systems, code, infrastructure, all of it keeping the company running smoothly. And yet, in that ballroom, I didn't exist.
Is that when the idea of asking for equity started forming?
Yeah, not out of anger at first, more like clarity. I realized something that night. The company relied heavily on systems I had built, infrastructure that nobody else fully understood. If I disappeared tomorrow, the company would panic within weeks.
That's a powerful realization.
It was. And I thought maybe it was finally time to be recognized as more than just an employee.
So that's when you decided to talk to your father.
Exactly. A few weeks later, when the surveillance system had proven itself and the numbers were coming in exactly as predicted, I went upstairs to the executive floor. I asked his assistant if he had a few minutes to talk.
Were you nervous?
Extremely. My father had a way of making every conversation feel like a negotiation. But I told myself this was reasonable. I wasn't asking for half the company. I wasn't asking for control, just 15%, a minority stake that reflected the infrastructure I had built over 12 years.
On paper, that sounds completely reasonable.
That's what I thought too. 10 minutes later, I was sitting across from him in his office, floor-to-ceiling windows behind his desk. The entire skyline stretched out behind him like a painting.
That must have been intimidating.
It was. He leaned back in his chair and said, "So, what's on your mind?"
And you asked?
Yeah. I explained everything calmly. The systems I had built, the predictive engine, the impact it was already having on Savelle's operations. Then I said I believed it made sense for me to have a small equity position in the company moving forward.
And that's when it happened.
Yeah. He stared at me for a few seconds without saying anything. Then he laughed.
The laugh that started this entire story.
Exactly. Not a polite laugh, not a surprised laugh. The kind of laugh people give when they think something is ridiculous. Then he leaned forward and said something I will never forget. He said, "Alex, you're a programmer." Then he tapped his desk and added, "Programmers get salaries. Owners take risks."
Wow.
And he wasn't finished. He leaned back again and said, "If you want to be an owner, you should start your own company."
That must have felt like a punch in the stomach.
It did. But the strange thing is, I didn't argue. I just nodded, stood up, and walked out of his office.
And what were you thinking while you walked back down to the 5th floor?
I was thinking about that folder on my external hard drive, Engine Core V1.0, March 2011. Because in that moment, I realized something important, something my father had completely forgotten.
The foundation of every critical system inside that company wasn't technically theirs.
Wait, what do you mean by that?
I mean, the original architecture, the core engine everything was built on, was written by me before I ever signed an employment contract with the company. Before I had a company email. Before I had an employee badge. Before Reynolds Logistics Solutions had any legal claim to my work.
So the technological backbone of the company started as your personal project.
Exactly. And over the years, I kept improving it, expanding it, integrating it into every layer of the company's logistics infrastructure. Routing systems, optimization models, forecasting tools. Everything ultimately connected back to that original engine.
And your father had no idea.
None. To him, it was just the system, something the tech department handled.
So when he told you to go start your own company, something clicked.
Exactly. For the first time in years, I stopped seeing myself as the invisible engineer, and I started seeing leverage.
That's a big mental shift.
It is. And once you see leverage, you can't unsee it. That night, I went home, plugged in the external hard drive, and opened the old folder. Engine_Core V1.0, March 2011. The timestamp was still there. The original source files. The early documentation. Everything proving that the core system existed before I ever joined the company.
That must have been a surreal moment.
It was. Because suddenly, the power dynamic I had lived with for 12 years didn't look the same anymore.
What did you do next?
I did something very simple. I called a lawyer.
That's when things start getting serious.
Very serious. I explained the entire situation, the history of the code, the architecture, the timeline, And I sent him copies of the original files with their timestamps.
And what did the lawyer say?
He went quiet for a few seconds. Then he said something that completely changed the way I looked at the situation. He said, "Alex, if what you're telling me is accurate, your father's company may be running its entire operation on intellectual property that legally belongs to you."
That's huge.
It was. But he also told me something important. Just because I had created the original system didn't automatically mean the situation was simple. Over 12 years, the company had built layers of infrastructure around it. New modules, integrations, client interfaces.
So it wasn't a clean separation.
Exactly. But the foundation still mattered. Without that core engine, the rest of the system wouldn't function.
So what was the strategy?
Patience. My lawyer advised me not to do anything dramatic right away. No threats, no ultimatums, just document everything.
Meanwhile, the company kept operating normally.
Exactly. The Savell contract was thriving. The predictive system was saving them millions. My brother was still being praised as the strategic genius behind it all.
And you were still in the cubicle.
Yep. Same gray fabric walls, same burnt coffee smell, same corkboard full of diagrams.
But internally, everything had changed.
Completely. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't the powerless one anymore.
Did anyone at the company suspect something?
Not at first, but eventually something happened that accelerated everything.
What happened?
Savell Industries requested a major expansion of the system. They wanted new predictive modules, deeper integration, more automation.
Which meant even more reliance on your technology.
Exactly. And that's when my father called a major strategy meeting with the executive team.
Including you?
For once, yes. And that meeting is where things really started to unravel.
What happened in that room?
My father stood in front of the board, full of confidence, explaining how the company was going to scale the system even further. He talked about expansion, efficiency, growth projections. Then one of the board members asked a simple question.
What question?
Who actually owns the core technology behind this system?
Oh, that's not a small question.
Not at all. And when my father answered, he made a mistake that would start the domino effect that eventually cost him everything.
When the board member asked who owned the core technology, my father didn't hesitate. He smiled confidently and said, "The company does, of course."
He assumed it automatically belonged to the business.
Exactly. In his mind, everything built inside the company belonged to the company. End of story.
But you knew the reality was a little more complicated than that.
Much more complicated. Because technically, the foundation of that system existed before I was ever an employee. And that detail would become very important.
Did you say anything during that meeting?
No, I stayed quiet. I had learned a long time ago that silence can be more powerful than speaking too early.
So you just watched everything unfold.
Exactly. The meeting continued. The executives discussed expansion plans, new markets, bigger contracts, and deeper reliance on the predictive engine I had built.
All while the board believed the company fully owned the technology.
Right. A few days later, my lawyer called me again. He had reviewed the company's employment contracts and internal policies.
And what did he find?
Something very interesting. My employment agreement did include a standard intellectual property clause. It said that anything I created during my employment belonged to the company.
That sounds pretty typical.
It is, but there was an important exception. The clause only applied to work created after the start date of employment. It didn't cover independent projects built before joining the company.
Which is exactly what that original engine was.
Exactly. My lawyer explained it like this. The company owned all the improvements, integrations, and modules that had been built over the years. But the core engine itself, the foundation everything depended on, was still mine.
That's a powerful position to be in.
It was. But my lawyer warned me that this kind of situation could turn into a long legal battle if handled poorly.
So the strategy mattered.
Exactly. Instead of making threats, he suggested something simpler, a formal negotiation.
With your father.
Yes, but this time the conversation wouldn't happen in his office. It would happen through lawyers.
That changes the dynamic immediately.
Completely. A few weeks later, the company received a legal letter requesting a discussion about intellectual property ownership related to the logistics engine.
That must have caused quite a stir inside the company.
It did. Suddenly, the leadership team wanted to understand exactly how the system worked, and more importantly, who actually controlled it.
When did your father realize you were behind the letter?
Almost immediately. He called me into his office the same day.
I imagine that conversation was very different from the first one.
Very different. This time, he wasn't laughing. He closed the door, sat down, and asked one simple question.
What did he ask?
What exactly are you trying to do here, Alex?
And what did you tell him?
I told him the truth. I said I wasn't trying to destroy the company. I wasn't trying to embarrass him. I was asking for the same thing I had asked for before, a fair ownership stake in the business I helped build.
The same 15%.
Exactly. Nothing more, nothing less.
How did he react this time?
At first, he tried intimidation. He talked about loyalty, family reputation, the dangers of legal disputes.
Classic pressure tactics.
Exactly. But the dynamic had changed, because this time he knew there were lawyers involved, and documentation, and timestamps.
So the conversation wasn't just emotional anymore.
Right. It was legal. Eventually, he leaned back in his chair and said something that surprised me. He said, "You're really willing to take this all the way, aren't you?"
And were you?
At that moment, yes, because after 12 years of being invisible, I finally realized something. Respect doesn't come from working harder. Sometimes it comes from knowing your value and refusing to walk away from it.
So what happened next?
The negotiations began. Lawyers from both sides started reviewing the technology, the contracts, and the ownership structure. And that's when the real shock hit the company.
What shock?
They discovered just how deeply the entire operation depended on that core engine. Without it, routing collapsed, forecasting failed, optimization stopped working. In other words, the company's entire competitive advantage vanished overnight.
That must have terrified the board.
It did, and that fear forced a decision that my father never expected to face.
What decision?
Whether protecting his pride was worth risking the entire company.
That's a brutal choice for any founder. Pride or the survival of the company he built.
Exactly. And for a while, my father believed he could win both.
Meaning?
Meaning, he thought he could outmaneuver me. At first, the company's legal team tried to argue that the engine had been transformed so much over the years that the original ownership didn't matter anymore.
The classic, "it's been modified so much it's basically new" argument.
Exactly. But the deeper the technical audits went, the worse things started to look for them. Because every layer of the system still relied on the original architecture. Remove that foundation, and the entire stack collapsed.
So the board started realizing the risk.
Yeah, and that's when the internal panic began. Suddenly, executives who had barely spoken to me in years started showing up at my cubicle, asking questions, wanting to understand the system better.
Amazing how fast people become interested when the stakes change.
It was surreal. For 12 years, nobody cared what was on my corkboard. Now, suddenly, everyone wanted explanations.
Did Marcus get involved at this point?
Oh yeah. My brother called me one night asking if we could talk privately.
Brother to brother.
Exactly. We met at a small bar near the office. First time in years we had sat down without the company involved.
What did he say?
At first, he tried to play the peacekeeper. He said the whole situation was getting out of hand, that the board was nervous, that the lawyers were making everything worse.
And then?
Then he asked me something interesting. He asked, "What do you actually want?"
Straight to the point.
Yeah. And I gave him the same answer I'd given everyone else, 15%. That was it.
Which, at that point, almost sounds reasonable compared to the alternative.
Exactly. But Marcus hesitated.
Why?
Because giving me 15% would change the entire power structure of the company. Suddenly, I wouldn't be the invisible engineer anymore. I'd be a shareholder.
Someone the board actually had to listen to.
Exactly. And my father hated that idea.
I can imagine.
For weeks, negotiations went nowhere. Lawyers exchanged documents. Technical experts wrote reports. The board started asking harder questions.
Like what?
Questions like, what happens if Alex leaves? How long would it take to rebuild the system from scratch? How much would that cost?
And I'm guessing the answers weren't comforting.
Not even close. One consultant estimated it would take at least 3 years to rebuild the system, and tens of millions of dollars.
That's catastrophic for a logistics company depending on real-time systems.
Exactly. Especially with contracts like Chevrolet relying on that performance advantage.
So the pressure on your father started increasing.
A lot. Eventually, the board scheduled a closed-door meeting without him.
Without the founder?
Yeah, that's when I knew things had escalated.
What happened in that meeting?
They invited me in for part of it. Just me and the board members.
That must have been surreal.
12 years in a cubicle. And suddenly, I was sitting at the boardroom table explaining the technology that powered the entire company.
Full circle moment.
Pretty much. I walked them through everything. The architecture, the dependencies, the timeline of development, the documentation proving when the original engine had been created.
How did they react?
Very quietly. Which honestly is scarier than yelling.
Because it means they're thinking.
Exactly. After about an hour, one of the board members asked me a simple question.
What was it?
He asked, if the company recognized your ownership and gave you a fair stake, would you commit to staying and continuing development?
And your answer?
Yes, immediately. I told them I never wanted to destroy the company. I just wanted to stop being invisible.
That's powerful.
A week later, the board made their decision.
What did they decide?
They called my father into a meeting and gave him 2 options.
Let me guess. Settle with you or risk the company collapsing in court.
Exactly. But there was a third consequence he hadn't expected.
What was that?
The board had lost confidence in his leadership. They believed his refusal to resolve the issue earlier had put the entire company at risk.
So they blamed him for the crisis.
Yes. Within a month, my father stepped down as CEO.
Wow.
Marcus didn't take the role either. The board wanted stability.
So who did they choose?
Me.
From cubicle engineer to CEO.
Yeah? Life has a strange sense of irony sometimes.
And the company ownership?
As part of the final settlement, my shares ended up being far larger than the 15% I originally asked for.
Because by that point, the board needed you more than ever.
Exactly. The funny thing is, if my father had just said yes the first time, he would still be running the company today.
One laugh changed everything.
Yeah, one laugh and 12 years of invisible work finally becoming visible.
Alex, that's an incredible story. Not just about business, but about knowing your worth.
That was the real lesson for me. Sometimes the quiet people in the room are the ones holding everything together.
That's an incredible ending, but I have to ask something. What happened after all of that?
After the transition?
Yeah, after you became CEO, after the dust settled.
Honestly, the first few months were the strangest period of my life. One day, I was still sitting in my cubicle writing code. The next, I was in the corner office, signing executive decisions and leading board meetings.
That's a massive shift in identity.
It really is. But the strange part wasn't the office. It was how people treated me.
Let me guess. Suddenly, everyone noticed you.
Exactly. The same executives who barely acknowledged me for years were now asking for my opinion on every decision. Managers who had never spoken to me were suddenly scheduling meetings. It was like I had become visible overnight.
That must have been surreal after spending so long in the background.
It was. But I also realized something important during that time. The company didn't just have a technology problem. It had a culture problem.
Meaning?
For years, the company rewarded the loudest voices in the room, the best presenters, the best negotiators, But the people actually building the systems, solving the problems, keeping everything running, they were almost invisible.
And you wanted to change that.
Exactly. One of the first things I did as CEO was restructure the engineering department. Better compensation, clearer ownership of projects, real recognition for the people building the infrastructure of the company.
That must have changed morale quite a bit.
It did. Productivity went up, innovation improved, and within a year, the company was performing better than it ever had before.
That's a pretty powerful outcome for a situation that started with a conflict.
It is. But the personal side of the story is a little more complicated.
I was wondering about that. What happened with your father?
We didn't speak for several months after he stepped down. For him, the company was his life's work. Losing control of it was devastating.
I can imagine that must have been incredibly hard for him.
It was. But eventually, we did talk again.
How did that conversation go?
Surprisingly calm. We met at his house one afternoon. No lawyers, no board members, just the two of us.
What did he say?
He said something I never expected to hear from him.
What was it?
He said, "I underestimated you."
That must have meant a lot coming from him.
It did. My father isn't the type of person who apologizes easily. But in his own way, that was an apology.
And your relationship now?
It's better than it used to be, actually. Without the company between us, we're finally able to talk like normal people.
Sometimes conflict clears the air in unexpected ways.
Exactly.
And what about Marcus?
My brother and I had a long conversation, too. He admitted something that surprised me.
What was that?
He said he always knew I was the one building the real foundation of the company.
Really?
Yeah. But in our family, the roles had already been assigned. He was the face, I was the engine.
And no one questioned that dynamic.
Exactly. Until the day it stopped working.
Looking back now, would you do anything differently?
Honestly, yes.
What would you change?
I would have spoken up earlier. For years, I believed that hard work alone would eventually be recognized, but that's not always how the world works.
That's a powerful lesson.
Knowing your value isn't arrogance, it's responsibility.
That's a great line. I think a lot of people listening right now can relate to that feeling of being invisible in their own workplace.
Exactly. And sometimes the people quietly solving the hardest problems are the ones nobody notices, until everything depends on them.
Alex, thank you for sharing this story with us. It's one of the most fascinating stories we've ever had on this show.
Thank you for giving me the space to tell it.
And to everyone listening, remember this. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one speaking the loudest. It's the one who built the system everyone else depends on.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you something a lot of listeners are probably wondering right now. What happened to the company after all of this?
Surprisingly, it grew faster than ever.
Really?
Yeah. Once the internal tension disappeared, the company was able to focus on innovation again. We expanded the predictive logistics system into several new industries: manufacturing, pharmaceuticals, even international shipping.
So the same technology that started the conflict ended up becoming the company's biggest advantage.
Exactly. Within 2 years, we doubled our client base. And several industries actually expanded their contract with us because of how well the system performed.
That must have been satisfying to see.
It was, but the real satisfaction didn't come from the growth numbers. It came from walking through the engineering floor and seeing people who finally felt valued.
The culture shift you talked about earlier.
Exactly. Engineers presenting ideas, junior developers leading projects, teams collaborating instead of competing for recognition.
That's a huge transformation for a company that used to reward only the loudest voices.
It is. And honestly, I think the company became stronger because of that lesson.
Sometimes crises force organizations to evolve.
Exactly.
Do people inside the company know the full story today?
Some do, but most of the newer employees only know parts of it. To them, it's more like company folklore.
The story of the engineer who became CEO.
Pretty much.
And the famous laugh that started it all.
Yeah, that laugh has become a bit of a legend internally.
That's poetic in a way.
It is.
If someone listening right now feels like they're in the position you used to be in, invisible, undervalued, overlooked, what would you tell them?
I tell them two things. First, keep building your skills. Competence creates options, and options create leverage.
That's powerful advice.
And the second thing is this. Don't wait forever for recognition that may never come. Sometimes you have to advocate for yourself. Sometimes you have to remind people of the value you bring to the table.
Because if you don't, they might never see it.
Exactly.
Alex, thank you again for sharing your story.
Thank you for having me.
And to everyone listening today, we hope this story gave you something to think about work, about family, and about knowing your worth. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to follow the show and share it with someone who might need to hear this story. And as always, we'll see you in the next episode.